Can you hear
Okay,
me?
sick. Yep, we can hear you. Okay,
Okay.
so let's get started. So we're going to be talking about capital this week. I've never given a lecture on capital. I have always found capital to be hard to understand, and it was just frankly sort of intimidating to me. And so I spent some time today and this past couple of weeks trying to understand it and compiling some notes that I had from before. And so this is a brand new slide deck. It was sort of thrown together last minute. It might work out, it might not, but this is what I got. So we do have this really interesting thing from Marx here. So his daughter Jenny asked everybody in the sort of family, the family friends. We have one from Engels, but basically, like she asked everybody to fill out this sort of questionnaire. It was pretty popular at the time, I guess, with like, it was a sort of like Instagram shared, everybody sort of fills out their stuff, whatever. And so we have like Marx's answers to like these sort of like prompts, what's your favorite virtue? Simplicity. What's your favorite virtue in a man? Strength. What's your favorite virtue in a woman? Weakness. And so we know his favorite color. We know his favorite dish. It's fish. His favorite names are the names of his wife and daughter, Laura and Jenny. But we have his favorite heroes here. The ones I want to point your attention to is his favorite heroes, Spartacus and Johannes Kepler. And so, those choices tell you everything I'm going to suggest to you about how Marx understood his theoretical project. Kepler assimilated the study of the heavens into mundane physics by discovering laws of planetary motion. Spartacus led a slave revolt. So there's like this sort of conjoining of those two efforts, the sort of like create the distilling of mystery into science, and also the sort of like overcoming of domination, I think is one way to describe what Marx is up to. So the background to capital, and this is what Marx has to say in his own words about it. It says to reveal the economic law of motion of modern society was the final purpose of this book. So this book, Capital, however, remains a very difficult book to fully understand, particularly to those who are new to Marxist ideas. And so I'm going to sort of foolishly attempt to explain the major moves of the book. I'm going to focus in on a particular part of the book, the last bit. And again, it's very silly. I'm just going to sort of breeze past most of what's interesting. I'm going to attempt to give you the parts that I think are worthwhile, but it's just very silly to try and talk about this book in an hour and a half, but like we're going to do it anyway. So again, the background to it, Marx once joked that it would have been very unpractical if he had died without completing Capital, because he's been working on it his whole life, right? At least in manuscript form. The first volume of Capital was eventually finished after many delays in the autumn of 1867 when Marx was 49, which is a fairly old, that's a fairly advanced age still at this time in the world. The remaining volumes, the remaining 2 volumes of Capital, were not published until after his death in 1883. So that was another 15 years of working on this book after the first volume of it was released or published. As he did for many of Marx's unfinished manuscripts, Engels added to, edited, revised, and ultimately published the other 2 volumes of Capital. Capital Volume 1, which we'll focus on today, is an attempt to reveal the contradictions of the capitalist mode of production and how it is the precursor to the socialist mode of production. Volume 2 is a deep dive into the marketplace itself, leaving behind the worker and the industrialist, which was the focus of Volume 1, to instead focus on the money owner, the money lender, the wholesale merchant, the trader, the entrepreneur. And then the third volume is perhaps the most unfocused on a single topic. It changes subjects from capitalist competition amongst the capitalist class to credit and finance capital. There's also some really great passages in the third volume that excited me as an environmentalist. He refers to like this metabolic rift concept that maybe you've heard me talk about before. This idea that we're in a metabolism with our environment, and then what capitalism does is it gets in between us, and in that it sort of causes a rift, making us think that we are not reliant upon non-human nature, or making us think that we can dominate nature in such a way as to do what we're doing now to it, right? And so that's this metabolic rift concept that he has already talking about in volume 3, long before climate change was a thing, you know. We often refer to Capital as a 3-volume set, you know, whenever you say, you know, how many volumes Capital are, there, people are going to say 3. But there was a 4th volume. The 4th volume, it wasn't completed, and it also wasn't published, you know, edited or published by Engels, which is why we only say there's 3. It was eventually published by some folks later on, and the topic of that volume is it's a critique of various theories of surplus value. And maybe those words don't mean anything to you yet, but Marx will talk about this in this volume, and we'll talk about that today because it's an important idea here. Marx sacrificed everything, including his health and that of his family, in order to complete this work. This is Marx's own words. He's writing to Engels in a letter. He says, "I was at the whole time at death's door. I thus had to make use of every moment when I was capable of work to complete my book, to which I have sacrificed my health, happiness, and my family. A week ago, I reached the pleasant point where I am unable to go out for want of the coats I have pawned, and can no longer eat meat for want of credit. I could not and cannot call the doctor because I have no money to buy medicine. For the past 8 to 10 days, I have been feeding the family solely on bread and potatoes, but whether I shall be able to get hold of any today is doubtful. Such a diet is not, of course, beneficial in present climatic conditions. I have not written any articles for Dana because I don't have any penny to go and read the papers. The best and most desirable thing that could happen would be for the landlady to throw me out. Then I would be at least quit of the sum of £22. But some such complacence is hardly to be expected of her. On top of that, debts are still outstanding to the baker, the milkman, the tea chap, the greengrocer, the butcher. How am I to get out of this infernal mess? I myself am in shit." So that's what Marx had to say about his life when he was writing this book. So yeah, you can assume he's asking Engels for money in this letter. So Leon Trotsky, of which I called Howard a Trotskyist a couple weeks ago, but Trotsky writes an introduction to one of the volumes of Capital, and this is what Trotsky has to say about what Marx is up to in this book. He says, "Certain of Marx's arguments, especially in the first, the most difficult chapter, may seem to the uninterested reader far too discursive, hair-splitting, or metaphysical." And he's referring to, like, the first chapter is about the commodity. And so Marx does this really long, intricate exploration and explanation of the commodity and like how that operates and all the ins and outs of it. Back to Trotsky, he says, "As a matter of fact, this impression arises as a result of approaching overly habitual phenomena scientifically. The commodity has become such an all-pervasive, customary, and familiar part of our daily existence that we, lulled to sleep, don't even attempt to consider why men relinquish important objects needed to sustain life in exchange for tiny discs of gold or silver that are of no earthly use whatever. The matter is not limited to the commodity. One in all the categories, the basic concepts of the market economy seem to be accepted without analysis as self-evident, as if they were the natural basis of human relations. Yet while the realities of the economic process are human labor, raw materials, tools, machines, division of labor, the necessity to distribute finished products among the participants of the labor process, and the like, such categories as commodity, money, wages, capital, profit, tax, etc., and the like, are only semi-mystical reflections in men's heads of the various aspects of a process of economy which they do not understand and which is not under their control. To decipher them, a thoroughgoing scientific analysis is indispensable." So that's Trotsky sort of like explaining to us this concept this, he's used a lot of words to basically say Marx is explaining to us something that we never really take for granted, which is that our economic realities are interesting and worthy of study, and are not, they don't just arise out of nothing, right? The market seems to appear to us as if fully constructed. This is just what humans do, right? Don't we just barter and exchange and make money? Like, isn't that natural? Marx says, no, it's not natural. We've done something quite remarkable here. Let's take a look at it, right? And so Trotsky is sort of identifying that aspect of what he's up to. Another way to describe this method of what Marx is up to here is the task that Karl Marx set himself was to analyze the capitalist system in a scientific manner, to make sense of capitalism by studying its historical development and thus outlining its general motion, tendencies, and laws of development. This approach is in complete contrast to that of the modern bourgeois economics, or the modern bourgeois economists, who have replaced political economy simply with economics, which concentrates simply on market relations and individual preferences and ignores the capitalist system as a whole and the society and politics nested within the economy, right? So again, much more simply, Marx is looking at the political economy, not just the economy. Marx understands capitalism to be a particular type of economy, not the economy, right? The bourgeois economics, or the bourgeois economists, would present to us capitalism as economics, whereas Marx presents it to us as a particular way of doing economics. And that gives him a much broader, perhaps more insightful way to describe capitalism, right? Or describe economics as a whole. So anyway, that was my attempt to sort of give you that little bit of intro. Again, I'm going to just breeze right on past some of the more like lasting and influential and interesting parts of Capital, because I'm going to get to the stuff that like I think can arouse debate between us, and it'll be fun. Let me see here. So again, Marx begins the first chapter. He's talking about commodities. His definition of the commodities. Commodities are products made for exchange rather than use. Right? There's a difference between use value and exchange value. And then this difference becomes the basis of capitalism, that there are some things have a use value, right? Like it's useful for something, a bottle of water, for example. But then that bottle of water sells for a particular price, right? It has an exchange value. And that the key insight here is that its use value, the commodity's use value, is never really in relation to its exchange value. In some respects, there's a slight sort of like you could draw a dotted line maybe between them, but oftentimes we're engaged in a lot of there's a whole lot of process going into propping up exchange value for certain things, lowering exchange values for other things that are sort of independent from how useful that thing is, right? And so what this ends up creating in us is this sort of fetish for the commodity. And so this is a very, very famous Marxist phrase, the commodity fetishism. The term fetishism, as used by Marx, is derived from ethnology, the study of early societies, right? So at this time, people were not conscious of their social or natural conditions of life. As a result, they attributed phenomena to supernatural forces. The gods did it, right? They believed they could influence the powers of nature by superimposing onto their own activities the actions of gods or spirits. In their imagination, inanimate objects acquired human or superhuman abilities and became a fetish. And Marx draws parallels between this and the actions of the commodity producing societies, where products have taken on a magical power. Under a developed form of commodity production, producers work in isolation from each other. It is not until their products are exchanged that they discover whether or not their private labor constitutes a part of the total necessary labor of society. So only if the exchange is successful does it prove to be a socially necessary part of the whole. Again, I understand that some of this may be going over your head. Basically, the idea here is that we end up finding out once we bring our sort of like alienated labor that we're doing in the factory, we're producing a commodity, we bring it into the market and we find out whether or not this thing we created actually ever has a value. And that's the only time our humanity really enters into it. It's sort of like reminds us of some parts of our first couple readings on Marx when we were talking about the alienated labor process. For the commodity producer, commodities seem to be exchanged by virtue of some mysterious natural characteristic of their own. These man-made things seem to have a life of their own, develop a power over human beings. This is a commodity fetish, which is then reinforced when commodities are routinely exchanged for money instead of through direct exchange. A coin or a piece of paper now seems to possess the magical quality of being able to buy all other commodities. They appear to have these powers simply because they are pieces of metal or paper. Producers simply run after money, right? They compete with one another in their search for this universal commodity. They appear to be independent of each other, but dependent upon money. Money rules their world, ruling society like a fetish. So we've placed ourselves back into a sort of system of mystical beliefs instead of a sort of like scientific understanding of, you know, what was promised us during like the scientific revolution, right? We enter back into this like pre-history version of like believing in mysterious forces, like the market goes up and down, you know, can't explain that, right? Line goes up and down. And so like moving past this idea of commodity fetishism, one of the major move that Marx talks about in the first couple chapters is this move from commodity money, commodity as like the form of the economy to money, commodity, money. So again, in pre-capitalist societies, what you would do is you would produce a commodity, right? You would produce linen, you would produce apples, whatever, and you would take that to the market and you would exchange it for money because you weren't going to survive just on apples, right? You needed to like get other stuff. And so you would take that money and then you'd exchange the money for other things. You would get the linen from your neighbor. You'd get the sheep's milk from the other neighbor, right? So that's CMC. Everybody understand that? Commodity begets money, begets commodity. What we've then done is we've moved away from that system to MCM, or as actually Marx says, MCM prime. The idea for us is not to produce a commodity to exchange it for money to get another commodity. The idea is to produce money, which then begets us a commodity, right, through the sort of productive process, which then we can sell for more money. More money, right? Money prime. So this move from CMC to MCM is a fundamental difference. That's the this is why some people say you can have a market, you can do market socialism. You can have a market in a that's oriented towards a different purpose other than producing excess wealth. You could have commodity exchange. You could have market exchange. But the way that we think of markets is that we're producing in order to make money, right? As opposed to producing in order to satisfy the needs and wants of society, right? That's a pretty important concept. Does everybody get that idea? CMC to MCM. You'll see this elsewhere. This is like a Marxist thing. People talk about this. Is anybody there?
Yeah, I'm
wall?
just afraid to say that I don't understand, but
okay, that's fine. Okay,
commodity begets more money, begets more commodity. That's the one I don't.
This is how it used to be. You would be an Apple you would have an apple orchard on your, you know, in your whatever, you'd be working on that as like a peasant or whatever, right? And you would get apples and you would need to go to the market to exchange that for money. You would have to sell them. And then you use the money to get stuff you need, commodities, right? You use the money to get your neighbor is the person who makes wool or whatever. And so you get the wool. From
Okay,
him.
but isn't that exactly how an apple orchard works today?
No, not at all.
Explain that to me. That's where
Because the
Is-
reason for the apple orchard today is to make money. In the process
Oh,
of which
got
we
it.
make,
Okay.
we get a commodity out of
Okay,
it, but we
all right.
trade that commodity to make more money. We're
Okay.
not in the game to
Okay, so
subsist
there's
on
one.
our
I feel like there's
exchange.
one further
Mhm.
to this, which is like an insurance company where there's never a commodity. It's just
Totally.
M.
Totally. This is
Or a
there's been both-
truckload brokerage.
there's books about that. It's and you're totally right that like I would encourage you to like allow Marx to be that's not a challenge to him. He's
No.
you're
No, I
like,
know, I'm
like
just
you're
saying.
explaining his like the point now is not that we're satisfying actual use values in the world. We're not creating stuff to like help people live. We're creating stuff to make profit. Right?
We're creating surplus value.
Yeah, and we're gonna talk about that for sure. Brett, you unmuted for yourself for a second. I didn't want to like breeze past.
Oh, no, it's all good. I was just talking about like, it sounds like the second people start speculating on things is like when,
Oh yeah,
Is-
okay.
like speculation is kind of where that profit motive comes from.
Interesting. Oh, okay. Okay, so this is so you are advancing perhaps an answer to the question that Marx is going to attempt to answer throughout the rest of the book. So far he's done like this is like the first couple chapters, but then he gets to the end and he's like, but where do we get this prime from? This thing that the different M, right? The second M is different from the first M in this new form of economics because there's more, right? And so money prime, that's just how people say it. Money prime is greater than money in this MCM, but where do we get the profit from? And so Brett says it's speculation. It's like market forces, right? Sometimes apples are more valuable than they are other times, right? And so some people maybe hoard them and wait for the right time to sell them or something like that. I don't know. Again, I would want to be more studied in order to say that. I think Marx would say that that's not like, there are certain things like that that just cause inflation. They don't really create value. In fact, that's the point here, is that like value is being created somewhere, but it's to talk about something mystical. Where does it come from? Marx says like we don't have any sort of answer to this. Up until Marx, the popular conception that where this profit comes from within capitalism comes from, you know, perhaps we can say this is exactly what your idea, Brett, is from buying cheap and selling dear, right? That's like the very famous phrase, buying cheap and selling dear. We say something quite similar to that, right? Don't we say something like buy the dip, right? Something like that, right? Buy the deep, sell when it's at the top. What do we say? Isn't that, I don't know.
Buy low, sell high.
Yeah, for sure. Buy low, sell high. Exactly. Right. Buying cheap and selling dear is the sort of like historical way to say that, right? In other words, right, so the profit or surplus value is created simply through the act of exchange, entirely within this sphere of circulation that we've constructed. So we built up this market, and somehow in there, through the various timings of or whatnot, we're creating value somewhere. Marx.
I have another question about
Okay.
about what you're talking about.
Yeah.
You said, okay, you have apples. You go to the
Mhm.
market, you exchange the apples for money, and that because you need to go get linen,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
I'm probably getting too into the weeds here, but how did this work? Like, was there a guy waiting around with money to buy all of the thing to like acquire the things? Like, what was he doing? How is that his job? Like he's the money guy. Like that's not a commodity, right? I don't know. Am I getting too into that?
No, I think you're hitting at like the sort of absurdity of it, honestly. You know,
Okay,
like
cool.
I think that that's exactly the point here is that like,
Yeah, because I got
you
a
know,
little because
we sort of accept these things. We sort of accept these things as like natural rules of how things work.
right.
But like what Marx is trying to do is like, if you actually just like look a little bit closer, it's sort of weird. Isn't it kind of strange? We're just like saying some things are worth this and not
It
that.
feels
and-
like it almost only happened by virtue of what we were talking about last week, where there was excess, right? Like if you were in
Oh.
a small enough, if you were in
Yeah.
a small enough community and everyone had a job, everyone's working for the good of the community. And then as soon as you get to be like more than 100 people, you're inevitably going to be creating excess, and you need to deal with it somehow.
That's
and
brilliant.
like money just it makes sense because it like you can hold the value of something longer than the commodity lasts. So
That's brilliant, Derek. And that's exactly where we're gonna go. Cause like Adam Smith
Okay.
is gonna tell us that story, and then Marx will disagree with you, but like not informed. Like he'll say that like it's you're exactly right that there has to be excess, but like he's gonna want us to think critically about how that excess starts.
got it. Okay.
Which is great. So that I love where your head's at. What is there anything I want to say before we move on? So Marx explains though that it's this idea that value is created during the exchange process, that like the circulation of money creates value. He's going to say that this is false. That's not where value comes from. The process of circulation is not a process of creation, but simply a means by which money is transformed into commodities and vice versa. Value changes form, but it is not created, right? It's almost like energy cannot be lowered, right? Isn't that like a physics law? You can't create energy or get rid of it. It just moves
It's
around.
matter.
Matter. Okay.
Energy cannot be created nor destroyed. You're right. No, it's energy.
Oh,
right.
okay.
And matter
Well,
has energy. So that's right.
This is that's what Marx is saying about value, that it's not created anywhere but like in the first instance. And so the fact that all of a sudden it appears here is sort of interesting, and we should figure out where that's coming from. Circulation, the exchange of commodities, consists both as a purchase and a sale. If there was an advantage in buying, this would be lost in the sale of the commodities. No net surplus value is created in the transaction, since one person's gain is one other person's loss. So we witness not the creation of surplus value, but the transfer of value from one party to another. It is a case of swings and roundabouts. Value is created not in circulation, but in the process of production. It is an expression of the socially necessary labor time involved in production. However, the value contained in a commodity is only realized through the act of exchange, namely when it's sold. Circulation is therefore vital to the process, but nevertheless, it produces no value, only serving to move existing value around. That's the function of the market. Just move value around. It doesn't create value. Is that like debatable for anybody at this point? There could be, somebody could say something and I wouldn't know how to respond to it. Is you could say something like, well, we need the market to store goods in a certain sector for a certain period of time because they're not useful yet. We have to wait for something else. And so there has to be some, you know, like value pops up on a temporal level during the production chain. So, you know, I wouldn't know how to say that, but I think Marx would disagree. So there is one challenge to this that like I do have the response to. And so like, some people say like, well, what about when commodities are just sold at higher prices than you know, than they would be otherwise, right? Above their actual costs. Like let's say just everybody gets together to decide to raise the, like, isn't that where money prime comes from? People just raise prices, right? I produced a commodity, I'm gonna sell it for more than it cost me to produce. Isn't that the whole point? Marx just tells us, well, if that consistently happens, that's just general inflation. That's just what inflation is. That's not the creation of new value. Again, I want to check in one more time. So this is why Capital is difficult. Capital is just a difficult book. There's no shame in being like, what the fuck? You know, like it's beyond me most of the time too, but like this is my attempt to give us a little bit of groundwork, and we can get onto some interesting stuff later. But like, so there's no value created in the market itself. The market itself doesn't create value, right? Are we there? Is that chill?
Yeah, no, I'm understanding what you're saying. I'm just like, no.
What's the point? Oh,
Well,
okay.
it's just like, no, like I feel like what he's saying doesn't support the final conclusion that profit by definition comes from quote unquote stolen wages, right? Like
Oh, okay.
everything, you know what
I
I
haven't
mean?
even told you really that part of the argument yet, but like, yeah.
Well, I'm
For
just
sure.
reading through all of it, and obviously
Yeah.
that's where he's going with it, right? And it's like,
That's where he's gonna go. That he's gonna say that like
yeah, and you
where
can
we
see
get
what
the
he's
yeah.
and what he's doing is he's like taking like he's like trying to draw this like switch not inaccurately like this historical line from like mercantilism to, you know, the corruption, the commodity fetishism, right, and yada yada yada. But I don't understand how that supports the idea where then it like twists into like profit is stolen.
Well, so he would say something like, well, where's this extra value coming from? Where are we getting this? What's the whole point of us doing this? Because
Well,
we
you
get more money, right? By exchanging.
yeah, well, but you know what the
Where does it come
capitalist
from?
right, but right, you know what the capitalist argument from that would be, right? The extra value comes
It's
from
the one that Brett said, right? Which Marx, I think, responded to.
I didn't hear Brett. I didn't hear Brett. I wasn't on.
Brett
What did he say?
said speculation, right? Like some
No, that's not.
commodities are.
No, that's well, yeah. I think that's a
Oh.
fair answer. Brett is risk, right? Risk is part of it. Is like is bearing risk. But what I was gonna say is it's that value is from either new value that's created through trade, right? New value that's created through the synthesis of ideas. New value that's created through risk being taken, right? That's not inherently through stolen wages.
I'm just trying to like distinguish because like the risk is not really the point here. The idea is that the commodity itself becomes more valuable because it's being traded.
Oh, okay.
That's what the capitalist argument is that during the trade, all of a sudden, so there's more money here. And we've all agreed to it. It's of course, it's not like it's debatable. It happened. It's the market supports it. But like, where does it come from? And
well,
so like,
I would say, I don't think that, I think that's an oversimplification again. Like, I think that the additional value that the market assigns to something is that's something that's in demand, and there was some sort of creation that took place, whether that's just an arbitrage, right? And that creation is just access, right? Because that's essentially what arbitrage is. What they're creating is access, right? Which the market is saying there is a value to, right?
Yeah.
Or whether it's in an idea, in a product, which again, the value that's created is again bringing that idea to an audience, right? I hear you, bro.
Part of that I really agree with. I think that there is some.
And I also hear you. What like this argument? I get until the stolen wages piece, but what you're saying right now makes a lot of sense. You're saying, well, but it's still an apple, right? And how come an apple that just got grown in this backyard, now once I take it to market, it's worth $7 instead of $5?
Yeah.
Well, that's a bad example because it's saying, well, that's from the drive and the cost of fuel. But I get you.
I get you. And so it's the idea. Let's just let that sort of inquiry drive us forward. Rory, did you want to like have something to say or?
Yeah, I guess it would be, is the market in this instance, like that's what you're asking, if this adds value, is that like the market of CMC? Is that, or? I'm
No,
trying
well,
to, I guess
somehow
like,
in
if you're
this,
saying, does the market add value, like isn't the market kind of just a definition of trading?
Right.
Like,
I-
but
I
like
think
the,
I
it-
think a Marxist way to describe the market would be divorced from the sort of capitalist like structures that we built on top of the market, which has things like profit in it, but yeah, but in the capitalist market, all of a sudden we end up with profit. And Marx wants to figure out, where does that come from? Because it didn't used to happen.
yeah,
right?
like when it was, okay, when it's just
When it was
apples, like you
CMC,
traded,
right.
okay, yeah. CMC, that's it, and then the other one is, okay, gotcha.
And so again, if you're holding on for a dear life to a little bit of a thread here, that's enough. Totally fine. Like, it's really challenging for me too. And I'm not positive I buy all of this myself, but like, I'm compelled by it. So, but so surplus value. So again, so yeah, so Marx ends up telling us, in the book is the argument for why money prime. The reason why that we get the prime there is because the labor there's a part of the laboring process that's not being paid to the worker. It's being held by the capitalist, and what we call it is surplus value. So when the labor works for us, they produce a certain amount of value, and we pay them less than the value that they produce. And that difference is our profit, and that's where the money prime comes from. That's the argument of capital, in as short as I could possibly make it. But of course, we can expand this. So,
Yeah, boom, there you go. You had all the answers.
yeah, here we go. Right, I have you all set up here. So, I can't see my notes. Okay. So Marx like wants to sort of like dissect the arguments why. So capitalists will come to say to us, yeah, of course that's where my profit comes from, but I'm justified, and it's not stolen. Like I provided a worthwhile contribution to this process here, and so I'm simply taking what's owed to me, right? And so these are the arguments that Marx talks about, right? Risk, competition for providing the means of, or compensation for providing the means of production, supplying jobs and means of subsistence to the working class, payment for overseeing the process. So again, he outlines these various arguments put forward by the apologists of capitalism to justify the role of the capitalist within society and the right to obtain a profit. Profit is said to be the reward to the capitalist for taking a risk, right? Is our favorite one, right? Of course, these arguments are nothing but, and this is a Marxist quote, he says, a whole litany simply meant to pull the wool over our eyes. They are an attempt to justify this dog-eat-dog society. This is not Marx anymore. This is my own stuff. An army of consultants and advisors limit the so-called risks taken by the capitalists, right? The bigger the capitalist, the less risk they take. It's far riskier to be a wage laborer. What risk is the capitalist undertaking? In fact, one could advance the idea that like the whole reason to become a capitalist is to sort of lower or shrink your precarity, right? So there really isn't much of a risk being taken by the capitalist, because the bottom falling out of a capitalist is much different than the bottom falling out of a wage laborer. The other sort of responses, the big far from providing workers with jobs and wages, the capitalists today are responsible for mass unemployment, demanding brutal austerity from the political representatives in power. They need a mass amount of unemployed, cheap labor. And so they work very hard to keep labor levels, to keep unemployment levels high. That's an inherent part of what drives the political motivations of a capitalist is to make sure unemployment levels are very high, so that way we can keep labor costs low, right? What's more, these wealthy ladies and gentlemen rarely play any role in production at all, right? Far from overseeing production, they're more divorced from production than ever, laying on some beach in the Bahamas, loosely connected to the real world through phone calls to their financial managers. Their only interest is making money. They have a very hazy understanding of the source of surplus value. All they know is that they need to purchase labor power from the worker. They know they have to squeeze as much surplus labor out of the workers, and they know that they can sell the commodities produced by the workers for a greater amount than that paid to the worker in the form of wages. Surplus value, in other words, is simply the unpaid labor of the working class. And there's this really great quote from Marx here where he doesn't, he's never sort of like pointing a finger at any capitalist. He never is sort of like saying that this is a moral failure of anybody or any person. In fact, he says this, he says, the capitalist does not care whatsoever about justifying their money making. They never are on this level, sort of like talking a philosophical debate about, surplus value and who's it for and whatever, right? They leave that and similar subterfuges and conjuring tricks to the professors of political economy, who are my the folks that trained me. They've told me all the reasons why surplus value is owed to the capitalist. He himself is a practical man. And although he does not always consider what he says outside his business, within his business, he knows what he's doing. And so I always really like that little passage there. He's a practical man. He's not gonna talk about philosophy. Anyway, Howard, what's your response to this?
No, dude, I think it's really interesting, bro. I think I think he's wrong about all of them except for the third point, like the supplying jobs and means of subsistence to the working class. I think that's kind of a joke. I don't know any capitalist that would like have any level of self. They would have any level of self-awareness at least and like make that argument, right? I disagree with the other ones, but I think that last quote is really accurate. And I think, I 100% think that's true. And I think, it's interesting. Like this, I mean, look, I know it's just the beginning of the lecture, but this for me is a lot more
like half
everything you're saying. Well, it's just a lot more digestible. Like this all makes a lot of sense. Like a lot of
this. Oh, that's great. I really like that's thank you so much for saying that. This is difficult for me.
No. This is like it's very clear. Like it's like, okay, these are his arguments. I see. This makes a lot. How do I say this? It makes a lot of sense in the way that 1 + 1 = 2. I just disagree with his original inputs. Yeah. That's all. But where he's getting his conclusions from, I'm like, yeah, no, for sure. Of course. Yeah.
That's what he wants. That's what he wants to do. He wants to sort of stay in the 1 + 1 argument, and because I'm like, he thinks that's going to be better.
And I would just argue that the numbers he's adding together are actually 2 + 3. But if he's adding 1 + 1 together, then dude, that makes a lot of sense. I disagree with the inputs. That's all. But no, it's
totally.
It's so less.
There's going to be some stuff to disagree about, and it'll be fun. So just before we move on, again, so this idea that regardless of the personal morality of this or that business owner, the laws of competition, the laws of capitalism force this sort of drive on all capitalists. And I'm going to, they call this like the race to the bottom, right? Every capitalist must take part in this race to the bottom or face losing profits to someone else. Marx has this to say. He says, capital, therefore, takes no account of the health and the length of life of the worker, unless society forces it to do so. Its answer to the outcry about the physical and mental degradation, the premature death, the torture of overwork is this: should that pain trouble us, since it increases our pleasure, profit, but looking at these things as a whole, it is evident that this does not depend on the will, either good or bad, of the individual capitalist, right? Under free competition, the immanent laws of capitalist production confront the individual capitalist as a coercive force external to him. The capitalist is not responsible for capitalism. He is simply doing his job, right? So it's mistaken for us. It's a misplaced anger or blame or whatever, right? For us to be like pointing our finger at this or that person who's enjoying their, the spoils of war, right?
It's interesting because I actually agree with that entire statement, but I think, well, most of it, I would say. I would say it's not so like calloused as there being a conscious thought of like, oh, well, why should I worry about that? Fuck that dude's life. It's going to make me money. I don't think it's that dark, but I think like the core of what he's saying is true.
Yeah.
But I don't think that means you throw the baby out with the bathwater, though. That means that you erect
Totally.
a construct around it to control for those things. And that's why we need government, and anarcho-capitalism doesn't work.
I'm now convinced that we have to talk about we have to talk about Rawls. It wasn't a plan of mine, but I think we're gonna have to do Rawls. You might like Rawls a lot, Howard.
Nice.
Let's see. So okay. Man, my notes are all fucked up here, dude. Okay, so there's like a cool thing that in the book ends up happening here is because he refers back to like what the ground that we've covered in this class. When we did like early liberalism, we talked about John Locke, we talked about life, liberty, and property and things like that, right? We talked about these movements away from ancient forms of political societies, and we talked about the founding of rights as a concept. And Marx has we've discussed a little bit of Marx's critique of that concept. We discussed during on the Jewish question. We have the sort of like radical leftist critique of that, but Marx doesn't offer that critique of rights. But what he does here is he offers a critique of capitalism in light of the rights that it purports to be supportive of, right? We usually think about, or the argument goes something like freedom and democracy and capitalism are all part of the same sort of like circle here, that like we get our political rights, we get our freedoms, we get our ability to pursue happiness through capital accumulation. These are all part of the same bundle of political advancements that we've enjoyed over the last 300, 400 years, right? That's the sort of story. That's the sort of story of the what Marx would call the bourgeois political economists, what we might call the liberal political theorists. And so I have a couple people here. I have Adam Smith at The Wealth of Nations. I have David Ricardo, who Marx is in sort of reverence towards, but also he criticizes. And then here's Jeremy Bentham. And so this is him, actually, Jeremy Bentham, his body in, I think it's the London College. And so in the philosophy department in London College, they still bring out Jeremy Bentham's corpse to come sit in faculty meetings. Jeremy Bentham's a pretty funny guy.
Yummy.
It's pretty metal. But so anyway, and so what Marx does here, so he sort of sets aside that whole argument about surplus value and stuff like that. And what he's going to want to do is sort of talk about just what I said, capitalism and the rights and stuff like that. And so I'll just say the quote and I'll explain it. He says, "The sphere of circulation or commodity exchange within whose boundaries the sale and purchases of labor power goes on is in fact a very Eden of the innate rights of man. It is the exclusive realm of freedom, equality, property, and Bentham." And so it's a very strange quote. What is he talking about? What does that mean? It doesn't make any sense. Basically, the summarizing of that quote is just what I said, that like the rights of man, the things the freedom, equality, whatever, things like that, those like we tend to think those as being associated with a free market, right? That's at least how the story goes, that like the free market is bundled up with those other rights. And he has Bentham here because it's just sort of funny. It's just like freedom, equality, property, Bentham. It's just this dude. Bentham is a philosopher of utilitarianism, right? The idea that you seek the maximization of your utility, right? That's like we try and figure out what is driving us to do things in this world. And Bentham and some others and some people he's associated with, James Mill and James Mill's son, John Stuart Mill, they would say something like, we're all trying to increase our utility. Our utility might be pleasure for some of us, right? Not a hedonistic pleasure for the most part, but like, we seek to just maximize our utility. This
Like
a
sex worker?
Like a sex worker.
Yeah.
For some, right? For some, that would be maximizing their utility. This is opposed to a deontological form of philosophical motivation, which is like universal truths based. So Bentham would say something like, yeah, you would murder somebody, obviously, if it maximizes your utility. If that person was going to kill your wife or whatever, right? A deontological person wouldn't say you don't murder that person, but they would have a different calculus. They would say like, no, well, you shouldn't murder people. And then they would sort of go from there, they would say like, under these circumstances, maybe it's okay. But like Bentham and the utilitarians would say like, no, you just do a calculation in your head. What's going to maximize my utility? And so the reason Marx has Bentham here is because that's the logic of capitalists. Right? It's utility maximization. And so he has it in here, right? He includes Bentham, this idea that like we pursue our own interests in there with freedom, equality, property. You might say something like pursuit of happiness. That might be, Bentham, like the reason why Bentham is standing in for something there. But so the rights named here are wielded by the classical political economists, Smith, John Locke, etc., as evidence of the divine right and natural aspect of free market fundamentalism. We call capitalism natural, right? Because it represents the freest economic arrangement and allows for humans to pursue their own desires. Marx sort of brings up this stuff in a sort of tongue-in-cheek way, right? He's being sort of funny. Each natural right, he's going to show over the next, couple pages, he's going to show how capitalism actually perverts all these. That the sort of the freedom that we are expected to experience under capitalism becomes a profound unfreedom. And I've already sort of explained that argument to you. That was a preoccupation of Marx's early years. The equality that capitalism and liberal capitalism purports to afford us is a joke, right? Where is the equality? Like that's one of the basic fundamental ideas in capitalism, is that we're unequal, right? And like that's okay. He talks about how property becomes this promise of property for all, but in reality becomes a very limiting form. Like you've heard that one, right? That like only enjoy property, and the rest of us find our limits of our freedom in others' property, right? And then again with Bentham, I think I've already explained. Our interests become, things that sort of like constrain us, right? This utopian vision of like capitalist liberalism, it falls down because the dynamism of capitalism, how productive and churning and energetic capitalism is, it doesn't allow for these rights of man to order the market, the logic of the market, for very long. And so if we allow our vision to not be as simplistic as a simple sort of supply and demand, like market, we end up seeing how capitalism has tendrils that gets into the rest of society. and it limits these things: freedom, equality, property. It actually creates a limiting factor in there. So we find a domination occurring, right? The irony that Marx notes is that the very same ladies and gentlemen who preach about freedom, liberty, individuality, and above all the market are the ones who within their own businesses demand the very opposite: organization, authority, cooperation, right? The defenders of the free market, the ones who so vehemently oppose any socialist plan of production within society as a whole, are at the very same time the most ardent supporters of a plan of production within the firm. As ever, therefore, we see the utter hypocrisy of the bourgeois.
Whoa. That's all kind of a joke, right? Like, that's
No,
all,
this is a very, very like
that's not a cogent
penetrating
argument,
insight.
though. That's not wait, what? Dude, that's not even a cogent argument. That's ludicrous. Everything he's been saying
Okay.
up to this point makes a
Well,
lot
so
of
what's
sense.
the argument? What do you what?
Well,
what's
okay,
so-
so
what's so
first of
horrible
all,
about that?
you're drawing a straight line between the idea that because let me rephrase that. The capitalist does not abhor structure, right? This argument that like, oh, they claim to just want this anarchic market is inaccurate. The capitalist's argument is that the free market creates a much more elegant and organic order than an artificial order that's instilled by men, right? So that's the first, complete oversight or like intentional dishonesty in this argument. The second thing is that trying to denounce the bourgeoisie consciousness, which celebrates the division of labor in the workforce because of denouncing attempts to control and regulate the processes of production, that's comparing apples to oranges, right? One of those is like a philosophical argument that, again, is underpinned by the belief that the organic structure and organization that the market creates is superior to one that a group of men could create, is akin to saying that they are championing an unorganized workplace. Like, those two things, I just had to pause you because I feel like up to this point, like, it's like, okay, those are some good points. I don't necessarily agree with them, but this is just, it's nonsense. Like, he's like being dishonest with these arguments.
Okay, I will have to digest that challenge. I'm not sure. Whoa, okay, you're playing.
Sorry. I'm not muted. Sorry. No, I'm listening.
Well, so in broad strokes, what he's saying is that there's socialized production, right? And we've decided that like the best way to go about this is through at least the sort of inkling or the hand gesture towards things like freedom, liberty, individuality, whatever. But in private, we actually don't ascribe to those things. And so and ultimately it turns the initial progressiveness of capitalism into its opposite, into a system that can.
Okay. So here's what I would say then is maybe, while I don't necessarily think that's the whole story, what if the argument was then that on a super micro level, let me give you that one, but on not quite a macro level is what he's talking about, but
A
like
meso,
right on a meso
level.
Is that the right word? I don't know. On a meso level,
yeah,
there is more freedom that's created in the ability of individuals and entities to bring creative force to the market, right? That if the government is, and I keep saying the government, but if there was a more structured,
essentially planned economy.
yeah, well, I don't even want to take it there yet, but like, I think that's more the freedom that's promised, right? The freedom of ideas, the freedom of this or that. And I would argue, again, I guess I'm going to have to take it there. I would argue that even on the labor level, there's additional freedom that's provided there, because laborers are not ascribed, you're the fucking bread man, and that's all you are. Good luck, show up to the bread line every day with your bread, and that's what the government has provided you with the role to do, really they have the freedom to choose, well, I don't want to be a bread man anymore. I want to be a concrete man, or I want to be a computer man, or I want to be an airplane woman, or I want to be a medicine woman, or, you know, I would argue that the structures that have to be tolerated within an organization to allow it to function correctly are not a chill on freedom in the same capacity that directive roles are. And in that way, I think that this ideal, and I want to be clear, I'm not defending the hyper idealized version of capitalism that he's attacking here, because I don't think that's real either, right? I've already conceded that we need government constructs to rein in some of capitalism's more unsavory tendencies when left unchecked, right? But I also just think that this, you know, hyperbole that he's using is bullshit.
It is very characteristic that the enthusiastic apologists of the factory system have nothing more damning to urge against the general organization of labor in society than that it would turn the whole of society into a factory.
Damn, that's
what he
straight up true. It's true. I didn't even catch that part, but yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Well, he's saying he's criticizing you.
I know he is.
Okay.
I get it. I'm criticizing him right back.
Okay.
I think he's, yeah.
Brian,
Yeah.
are you essentially saying that like we have all these tenets and ideologies that we like want to uphold? That we want to uphold, like freedom and whatnot, and then like we ascribe with capitalism, like, oh, but it's just natural that I work 40 hours a week, that everybody works 40 hours a week. Because that kind of like within the capitalist structure, we concede a lot of these virtues for, I guess, I'm not sure, for not dying, I guess is the
Totally.
one
And
thing.
like Marx would have like something. Marx is such a not black and white thinker. And in fact, that's what dialectical really means. Is like he's just not, he would never say something like, oh yeah, and that's why capitalism's bad. He would say like, no, capitalism created within us, along with its sort of like harnessing of politics and ideology, it created within us a yearning for freedom and individuality and expressiveness and creative labor. It created a yearning within us for producing something. And it's not serving its function anymore. It's not allowing us to do these things. It's not allowing us to pursue these innate rights of man that they're claiming are innate, but actually, you know, Marx would say like, no, that was probably a result of capitalism and how totally it bulldozed earlier forms of societal organization like feudalism. And so this is what I have written down to like continuous. He says, the initial progressiveness of capitalism, right? This sort of like creating within us this yearning, right, for freedom, property, and bentham or whatever. It turns it into its opposite. It turns it into a system that can no longer develop or utilize the productive forces in society. Competition and private ownership, having provided the motor force behind the development of the means of production in the heyday of capitalism, now present themselves as enormous barriers to the development of science, technology, and industry, as enormous fetters on the progress of society and humanity, fetters that periodically plunge society into a state of overproduction, crisis, barbarism, crash. You know, these like silly things that like happen naturally in this system in order to keep it, keep it going, when we could just orient it in a different direction, right? And like unchain the things that it is good at doing, which is producing stuff, right? Like we can organize it better. And so he's just simply saying that it's ironic that the arguments that he's replying to. Did somebody unmute and want to talk?
Yeah, I think that's cool, right? Like he can do that, but I think if he's going to do that effectively, then he can't use so much hyperbole and he can't like create this. He's like creating this straw man argument, You know, it's like no fucking capital. Like he's just making shit up and then throwing darts at it. And it's like, yeah, bullseye, bro. Nice one. You really got him there. It's like, come on, dude. Like,
Well, he misses the target sometimes for sure. I don't think I mean, he's inspiring, you know, for the
What is the
person.
caricature you see him upholding, Howard? Like, what is the hyperbole that seems outrageously incorrect?
what? Everything I just spent the last 7 minutes saying.
Sure, I guess to like sum it up though, in like, maybe I missed that part. Maybe I wasn't paying attention.
Well, I think first of all, the first thing I said is that he's attacking this idea that capitalists abhor structure, and he's missing the point, right? Like capitalists don't abhor structure. They just believe that the market has the capacity to create a more elegant structure than a group of bureaucrats, right? And then the second
But
thing
aren't
is
capitalists kind of a group of bureaucrats? Like, isn't like any corporation needs a huge level of organization, right? Same thing
Yeah,
with the
but
government. I mean, the government and a corporation are actually probably more similar than they are different as far as like organizational. Like, I think that's what Brian is saying is like, where we like look at freedom as almost disorganization, which I would agree with that point, that like true freedom comes from a level of organization. I don't know if I agree that like, I think capitalists are highly organized. I don't know if that's necessarily a bad thing, but
totally.
Maverick, did you want to say something? I thought I heard you like clear your throat or something.
I just thought it was funny when Howard was saying, I want to be a dirt man and I want to be a concrete man. I just thought that's what I was chuckling about. It's just like the idea of someone saying that. I was picturing the person saying, whoever's, somebody saying,
Medicine-
I want to be a
medicine woman was
Yeah,
next.
I wanna
Dude,
be a
here's the
medicine
deal.
woman.
It's funny because you know where I got that terminology from is I was at a conference selling to a bunch of like EAP and union folks,
Mhm.
and that's how they refer to themselves.
A
They call
medicine
themselves
man?
like a telephone man or a
A
concrete man.
I want to be a computer.
I was just trying to speak in language.
I know.
that you
I was
guys would
laughing
understand.
because I heard, the joke is, are you a cat person? And they're like, no, I'm a person.
I'm a cat man.
That's why I was
So-
laughing. Sorry. I had no comment on
Just to like wrap up my point here. So we have an incredible array of scientific knowledge and technology at our fingertips, and yet capitalism is unable to utilize it. Technologies such as 3D printing, artificial intelligence, and other automation techniques open up the possibility of completely revolutionizing production and in turn society as a whole. But under capitalism, this remains mere potential, with the application of new machinery and technology leading not to increased living standards, but simply to ever increasing unemployment, insecurity, and overwork at one end, and the accumulation of profits at the other. And so the argument goes that Marx is making is simply like a level of organization introduced back into how productive capitalism is could organize society in the same way that we have decided to organize our factories. And there's, he's making that argument, and like, it's,
Well, I think that-
it's a-
You don't think it's effective? Is that what you're gonna say?
No, and I think it's a good argument, that there might be, challenges to it.
The
just as
one
there is
I
everything.
love everything this dude says. Like I just absolutely agree with and just think it's
That's cool, dude.
most of it is profound. The one thing that I have trouble arguing against is this topic because it's just so simply the easiest counter argument to what you just said is like, well, what about the microwave? Right? Do you know why those types of things are invented or from direct profit motive? Massive corporate entities getting together and inventing something that astronauts can use to heat food in space. And now it's in my kitchen. You can buy a microwave for
So there's something
$27.
inherent in,
You know what I mean?
there's something inherent in the way that we've organized capitalism now The
Mhm.
parts that Marx finds objectionable are actually the parts that make it energetic and productive. That's your argument, right?
I guess, yeah, like, I guess my
Okay.
argument is the 3D printer, as mentioned,
Uh-huh.
wasn't invented to be utilized to help human beings. It was
Right.
invented for profit motive and
Yeah.
will eventually, through whatever Moore's curve or whatever the fuck,
Right.
will
Trickle
be in
itself
every,
into.
yes, will
Yeah.
be in everybody's household, improving
Okay.
their lives.
Yeah.
That's, and I don't know that
I don't know.
human
Yeah.
altruism will ever
Has
win
the same.
against,
Yeah.
yeah, like, I don't think that the invisible hand is, I think the invisible hand will ultimately be our downfall as human beings. I really believe that profit motive cannot go hand in hand with ethics. I really believe that.
Yeah.
But I don't know that I believe that
Yeah. I mean,
this version of the world would, maybe, I guess one point is that it's going to be a little bit slower. You know, I don't know that we would have 3D printers as fast, or that I would get a 4090 next year.
right.
You know, whatever.
I
You know what I'm saying?
so this is a challenge, like the last slide of this entire lecture, which I'm not even sure we'll get to because there's quite a lot left. And
I do have to go at 8.
Yeah. But and so we might make this two different lectures. But the last slide has that quite, you know, it's like, come on, what's all this about? Like we're enjoying life, right? I like my blue jeans, you know, stuff like that. And you know, that's something that we're gonna just be like I've questioned that my whole life, and I'm probably never gonna have an answer to it, and I don't think anybody will really.
Well, that's a
like,
good point. That's a really good point, though. Is how would we ever know, really?
yeah, there's no counterfactual to this.
Yeah,
Totally.
exactly. Which is interesting.
Yeah, and so a lot of folks say, well, you know, if it's not falsifiable, the entire Marxist theory is not falsifiable, so why are we even bothering? You know?
Well, and can't it be both? Like, can't it be that like there are
No.
things that have I think Marx, he said he's not a black and white thinker, Maverick. So I think maybe it could be.
He's Buddha.
No, like if there's, you know, the microwave's chill and all that, but I would have really preferred a very proper public transit system over even, like, I sometimes like my car. Most of the time it's a huge pain in my ass.
Yeah.
But
What
like
kind of
if I
car
was
do you
able
have?
to- I
Yeah,
have
that's because you have a shitty car.
Honda CRV.
Yeah,
I'm about
that's
to buy a
I've
Honda.
had
that's the
shittier
thing though.
cars
It's like
that
public
I've liked more.
transportation. Public transportation's great if you're poor and you like don't have a nice car and
Oh
you don't
my
have the
God.
capacity to like.
In this country, that is true. But I would prefer to live in a place where the city's walkable, where I just wouldn't have to
Totally,
get in
bro.
my
Of
car
course,
every time I went anywhere.
of course
And
you
usually
would.
those places are where the car manufacturers haven't had like a death grip over the throat of every legislative action in the last 100 years. Like if you look at
Sure.
Arizona and Texas, like those places are built for cars, and there's compared to like Amsterdam. I mean, it makes me want to cry, and I know everywhere can't be the same, but I also just think like cars create such an erroneous, like it's way too. I don't know. It's terrifying once to be
I
conscious
totally
of how
agree.
many cars there are. Just in general.
I super agree with you there, and
Critical agree.
I don't know what the answer is to that argument, but I do know that I do think in that particular argument, when we're talking about transport, that there is a best of both worlds. I think that we could have extremely luxurious public transport and you could feel like you were being brought to a place in your own space very easily. If we, you know what I mean? Like if you look on a freeway,
Like Tokyo or something
yeah,
like that.
exactly. If you look on a freeway, I think even better than Tokyo. We're so rich in America. If you took the cost of every one of these dumb fucking cars in Los Angeles and put that, imagine the public transport that we would have, you know? And if you look down the freeway, like imagine how many empty seats are in that gridlocked mess, you know?
You'd
So
have to do
I think
some
you're right.
massive planning of the economy in order to pull that off.
Yeah,
You'd
but
have to,
like, dude,
Yeah.
really rein
play City
back.
Skylines for like a week, you know what I mean? Like what's
Hey,
happening?
I
maybe
totally agree. I'm on this train too, for sure.
Maybe
But
I'll change
but
my
not
mind.
literally.
Maybe I'll change my mind
Figuratively
when I
on the train. Brian.
250 duly.
We have 10 minutes left. This is kind of a natural place to end after this next slide, so that's fine. And then I do have a lot left to talk about, so we'll do that next week, I guess. But is there a good transition into this?
I want to know the brass tacks of this. Like, maybe you can sum up everything you just said in like a simple to understand.
So I'm going to say that actually. So the
Okay.
natural right. So there's the myth of political economy, right? The natural rights that capitalism purports to recognize and foreground end up being a bludgeon that the upper class uses to beat down the worker, right? Ultimately, the first part of capital, the stuff we've all talked about up until now, can be broken down to this. By placing such a high level of importance on decentralization and individualization, capitalism ultimately ends up with a highly centralized and dominating monopoly of capital over human beings. Marx argues this by buying all the premises that are argued in favor of this market economy, right? It's more productive. It's, you know, it's closely aligned to what happens when nobody tells us what to do or whatever, right? But he just follows capitalist system to the letter, and what we end up with is the destruction of individualism and all the rest of the natural rights that are supposedly held in highest regard under capitalism. That's like the first part of capitalism, of Capital, the book Capital. That like all the sort of things that we build on top of society that are not economics, capitalism gets rid of them all. You know, even the ones that are supposedly linked hand in hand with capitalism, freedom, you know, things like that. As the book continues, turning at last to the key concept of class struggle, Marx writes at length about what he describes at the end of this quote on this page, the tanning of the worker. So I'll just read the quote. So we leave the sphere of simple circulation. So again, I have to explain what that is. So there's this myth of political economy that like the worker comes into the market and sells their labor power to the person who's going to pay the most for it. You know, the owner, the capitalist. And this is a free exchange. The capitalist produces a commodity based on the workers' labor, they pay them the wage, it's free, it's a free exchange. The capitalist has the commodity, they sell that commodity to somebody who's buying it, it's a free exchange. There's no domination occurring or whatever, this is a completely natural process, right? But once we leave that simple sphere of circulation, Marx says, if we like allow our brains to not be a little babies, and like actually understand that like markets exist within societies, exist within economic systems that like construct that society, which construct the market, which, you know, whatever. We leave that sphere, we're going to be more critical of it than we normally are. A certain change takes place. He who was previously the money owner, the person buying the labor, now strides out in front as a capitalist. The possessor of labor power follows as his worker. The one, the capitalist, smirks self-importantly and is intent on business. The other is timid and holds back, like someone who has brought his own hide to market and then now has nothing else to expect but a tanning. I just love that's my favorite. That maybe is my favorite quote of Marx. Someone who has brought his own hide to market and now has nothing else to expect but a tanning. And so Marx will tell us what this tanning looks like and how it works. He describes half-starved widows giving up their children to toil in the matchmaking industry, working all day, facing very early death because of the industrial process. He writes about groups of desperate workers and their families petitioning local governments to reduce their work time to 18 hours a day. But Marx's key analytic point is that mainstream economists who ignore the class antagonism at the heart of capitalism, who purport this myth that there's just free peoples exchanging, right? You know, that like these people are equal. People who purport that myth they're obscuring a central element Under feudalism, the direct producers, peasants, are clearly forced into giving up some of their surplus labor, right? It's clear. We, of course, understand. The peasants get dominated in feudalism. We know that, right? The time they spend working, but not to meet their own but not to meet their own ends, right? Or own needs, right? They give that time up to the ruling class, the lord. The coerced transfer, that coercion in that transfer is out in the open. We can see it. We can identify it. Under capitalism, the immediate producers, the workers, are legally free to make contracts with anyone if they're willing to go hungry, right? If they're willing to simply go hungry, no one, right? So like, I may reread that because I fucked that up. Under capitalism, the immediate producers, the workers, are legally free to make contracts with anyone, or if they're simply willing to go hungry, no one. So that coercion is disguised. We don't see that coercion. We don't recognize it as coercion. And so we end up telling ourselves this myth that there's this free exchange going on, that the capitalist and the worker are somehow on equal levels, that they've freely engaged in this contract negotiation. And so that coercion and how that coercion happens, what the result of that becomes, what the rest of the book is about. And so, but we still have to sort of answer this question that Derek brought up very early, and then we'll end with that, because that's going to be the topic for next week. This question that how did it start?
Bryce, sorry, man, I have to go right now.
Yeah, okay. It started somewhere. It started with like somebody accumulating a bunch of stuff, a bigger society. And so this will become what we talk about next week. It's this idea of primitive accumulation and how that leads to the division of labor, and Marx has a particular story to tell about accumulating and how that accumulation happens. Anyway, thanks guys, appreciate it. I think everybody dropped off basically by now, but appreciate it. Thanks. I'm gonna stop.
Thank you, Brian.
Thanks,
Thank
dude.
you.
See ya.
See you later.